Hi everyone, and welcome to the Praise of Laziness Symposium. Before we start, I just wanted to give you a bit of introduction to Mladen Stilinovic and why I have chosen to discuss about the topic of laziness. So grab some tea or coffee and let's jump into it. Mladen Stilinovic was born in 1947 in Belgrade and died in 2016 in Pula, Croatia. He left high school in the 1960s, and from then on he was self-taught. His early works were experimental films and performances. In those early days, he was part of the group of 6 artists, and they were all revolting against the ideologized society, conservative art, and conventional behavior, and their activities reflected the libertine spirit of 1968. Between 1975 and 1979, the group performed over 20 exhibition actions in the open. Stilinovic also used his apartment in Zagreb as an exhibiting space and artist meetup. So how does all this tie in? Well, ASU2 is a unit in second semester here at Norwich University of the Arts, and the aim of this unit was to organize an exhibition. Whilst researching, I came across an Eflux article about Mladen Stilinovic's work. It was an interesting read. I highly suggest it. All the links will be in the description down below. So after further researching Stilinovic, I came across his text from 1993 called Praise of Laziness. The most interesting thing that Stilinovic said was, artists in the West are not lazy and therefore are not artists, but rather producers of something. Their involvement with matters of no importance, such as production, promotion, gallery system, museum system, competition system, who is first, their preoccupation with objects, all that drives them away from laziness, from art, just as money is paper, so is gallery a room. Artists from the East were lazy and poor because the entire system of insignificant factors did not exist. Therefore, they had enough time to concentrate on art and laziness. Even when they did produce art, they knew it was in vain. It was nothing. So this got me thinking about the broader definition of the word laziness, but also the creative process of artists and creative individuals in general. I think now more than ever, it's important to talk about laziness, to rip apart the misconceptions we might have had about it, and help each other during these strange times. So now let me introduce you to my guest speaker today, Carl Rowe. He is fine art lecturer and also the course leader at NUA. Uh, I got to mention that it was my pleasure having Carl as my BA Fine Art tutor. Carl is primarily a printmaker, but has also done performance, video, text, and even experimented with some culinary methods. um, and he graduated from Manchester Polytechnic with MA Fine Art in 1985. He is internationally recognized and has exhibited in many printmaking shows, including the Talent Print Triennial and the third Douro Global Print. Hope I pronounced that right. And he is an artist member of Outpost here in Norwich, where he also has a studio. Carl is a member of the Printmakers Council and a regular contributor to Impact printmaking conferences. And I got a quote, Carl here. He says, "I can't escape my concern for the wrongdoing in the world. A surface layer of humor and absurdity masks a strong undercurrent of despair in my art. So I observe how the manipulative, greedy, and corrupt are blissfully engineering repetitions of the calamities and failures documented throughout history." That's a very bold statement. Hi, Carl. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Yes, that was a bold statement. And well, what is interesting is that, like everything globally, that probably should be rewritten in light of the COVID-19 virus outbreak. I think that skewed probably everything that we thought we could see emerging and brewing. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
And perhaps I have to go back even further into history to think that that what we currently have is a repetition of something that we perhaps had in the Middle Ages or even earlier.
Well, then also there's a whole new field of conspiracy theory and the cause of it. But due to this pandemic and everything, and you being a tutor, a course leader, a printmaker, and when not teaching, do you have time to be lazy?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing. Because laziness. I don't think that what you're talking about in terms of laziness is unproductive, even if the production is at a sort of meta level. I have been anything but lazy. In fact, I think I'm probably quite exhausted from being even more active than normal. The types of productivity that obviously the education, the teaching and learning is quite different. It's all online. We're coming up with more inventive ways of being able to provide something that I think isn't a surrogate for actual physical activity or physical social connection in teams. Can't be a replica, but is something that fits the format of us working, but sort of vicariously. So that's been quite demanding and rewarding in many ways. In terms of creativity, I know we were talking just a little bit earlier about, as an artist, what I might have been making. I feel duty bound not to try to go to my studio. So my studio remains bereft of me inside it, and I've tried not to find ways of replicating the kind of work that I would otherwise be making effectively in that studio space. So as a creative individual, and I think creativity is something you don't turn on and turn off, it's been oozing out of me in different ways. It's been coming out in the kitchen. You mentioned culinary methodology. I always point out that although I've used culinary methodology as an artist, I actually do also enjoy cooking, and I'm not too bad at it. And growing things as well. So I think, the garden, I've turned over a whole chunk of garden to vegetable growing, which has been, I think, kind of creative. Certainly some of the ways that I've cut beer cans up to scare birds off are quite definitely bits of artwork. So the creativity has crept into the need to find rewarding things to fill in those other spaces. Have I been lazy? I've daydreamed. I've written notes down here and thinking, what is laziness? And laziness, I think, often is daydreaming. And I have found myself still finding time to stare into space, to kind of fix my focus beyond infinity, and to allow my mind to wander, which I think I couldn't not do. I sometimes do that, but I shouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think, I think we kind of both generally have the same kind of meaning of laziness. I think laziness in Stilinovic's like terms, but then also Kazimir Malevich also wrote that a couple of decades before. It's laziness is, I guess, in this sense, like the purest way to criticize and protest against the Western capitalism and the Eastern socialism, kind of in the context of Stilinovic, and when he was writing this text in the 90s when Eastern Bloc was falling apart and also Yugoslavia was breaking up. Before I get into those topics, wanted to ask you more about your practice, because I do tend to see similarities between your work and Stilinovic's, and your work is quite bold and focuses on socio-political slogans and symbolism, ultimately sending a message. The first work of yours that I saw was the fake ballot in 2017, when the B award just started, and so I wanted to ask you if what artists have influenced your practice, and why have you chosen the language of symbolism? Because me kind of having that geometrical abstract painting background, it was a challenge to learn about Stilinovic's language, and took me some time to actually figure out, what he was trying to say. And because when you see his work, one might think it's just, it's ripped money, or it's just collection of photos, but it's actually a language in itself. So could you tell me a bit about your work?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of influences, I think I always go back to Robert Rauschenberg. As a student, I was fascinated by Robert Rauschenberg, and I realized that there continues to be a kind of a fascination. He continues to be contemporary, even though he died over 10 years ago now. and I think the thing as a student, and the thing that has endured in terms of my interest, is how he perhaps tried not to generate new artifacts or new symbols or slogans in his art. He just kind of rehashed or recontextualized things that he found. Oh, that thing about walking around the block and only ever making art out of what he could find in New York at that time. And I think, yeah, that ties in with semiotics. It ties in with advertising in the 60s and 70s, and all of these things, we become aware of them perhaps in the 50s and 60s, and particularly in America, like Marshall McLuhan's writing. But they continue to have influence on us. It's just that the technology and the methods maybe have changed. That we're using smartphones, and we're using video conferencing and social media apps even more over the last 2 months than we ever have done before. So the technology changes, but it's the things that you find in that early kind of work that comes out of semiotics in the 60s and 70s, you still find in things like Mark Titchener's work now. And so, I do find myself sometimes using recognizable symbols. I've used, fairly recently, I've used symbols from engineering, from aviation as well. I find that quite interesting. The way that we follow symbols. I quite like the notion of an international language of symbols as well. So we get around language barriers, and this is why airports, I think, are particularly interesting, because they're little nodes and hubs and places where people from all around the world with all different languages come and have to navigate. And so we have this international vocabulary of symbols that tell us where to go, where arrivals are, where flights are, where the toilets are, where the telephones and taxis and buses are, but also telling pilots where to land, how to taxi, where to go. There's a language, an international language of symbols that the public that are using the flights don't necessarily recognize. So, and I've also invented my own symbols, and I think that's kind of interesting. Then we get into Tapier's kind of territory, that if you invent a symbol, it might be that somebody believes it, but they can't decipher it. And sometimes I've invented symbols that do have meanings and representations. I created 3 symbols for the 3 different body types: the ectomorph, mesomorph, and I forget the third.
Octomorph, I think.
No. That sounds right. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. But then sometimes, and I get very worried about magic and mysticism and spirituality and symbols coming from somewhere inside. Nevertheless, it does sometimes happen. So in fairly recent work that I've been doing, I found myself making circles with crosses through them. They look very Christian. They look early Christian. And if they are, then it's just because things have lodged in my subconscious somewhere. Yeah, so I do like, I like using language because I like the way language breaks down. I like using symbols because they are visual and instantly recognizable or decipherable in some way, but can also be kind of encrypted. And I think I often avoid just making pictures, and I think that does come back that goes back to Robert Rauschenberg, really, and that it's actually there's something in that réécriture, in that kind of gathering together what has already been created and putting it together in unusual or unexpected ways, or perhaps modeling a subconscious way of ordering the world, that becomes quite fascinating.
Yeah. And do you focus on those symbols having like a set meaning, or are you open for the viewer's interpretation of those symbols?
Interpretation, I think. I mean, with the case of the fairly recent piece where I made aluminium signs that were from runways that were in front of the woodcut print of Saint Jerome in his study, or kind of referencing Saint Jerome in his study, translating. It was the fact that these arrows pointing into 3 vertical bars could could mean all sorts of things. And at the exhibition, people were saying, I think I know what that means, and does it mean this, does it mean that? I like interpretation. I like the fact that, well, it's to do with formats. It's like, again, I've never done a billboard, but I think billboards are fascinating simply because you know the formats, and you know normally you're going to be sold beer or a car or trainers or something. As soon as you use a billboard for text or a symbol or an image that seems to not necessarily tie in with a normal sort of capitalistic sense of selling something, you're intrigued. And everyone knows what a billboard is, so everyone has a way in to the work.
And the eyes are already like set and kind of prepared to read and receive the message as well, I think. Yeah. Also, kind of, then we mentioned the whole kind of capitalistic and socialist way of working, and then their ideology. I kind of came to notice that both capitalism, socialism, and religions as well, they all worship hard work and productivity. And when you think about it, like in capitalism, you work a lot, you get higher salary, you're more happy. If in socialism, you work for others, and that should make you happy. And with the religion, there is, the sin of sloth, and that means, you should contribute to the society and everyone around you. And so when you think about it, then all the conflict that's been raised, have been happening, and so many blood spilled just for people to work for other people's benefits, it kind of does do start to question, then being lazy is very anarchistic and counter productive, and kind of, showing the two fingers to the system, I guess. But yeah, and then there's Stilinovic kind of works primarily with questioning economy and language through party slogans from the Socialist Party. He also uses people's phrases on the streets and some of his own statements. And I really liked this little quote Stilinovic said in one interview. He said that government blackmails people with money. So in general, I just wanted to ask you what are your thoughts about like being Western artist and being labeled as a producer by Stilinovic?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot that you've already mentioned there that's kind of got me thinking.
Right.
I mean, and I mean, certainly, yeah, I was brought up in the West. I've lived in the UK all of my life. And I think definitely the late 60s, early 70s, and the kind of the notion of post-war reconstruction. I mean, it's an interesting mix because there was tremendous industrial and scientific discovery, and so we kind of felt at a pace with that, and keeping up with the pace would mean that we'd be very productive, feverishly, excitedly, optimistically productive. And I've made work about that as well. And the sort of the breakdown of that, the letdown of it, as we begin to see some of the corrosive nature of greed creeping in. I suppose with deregulation in the late 70s, early 80s, the Chicago group kind of thing, and Milton Friedman's construction of neoliberalism. We see even Friedman himself said he'd underestimated the greed of people, so the driving force of social betterment breaks down as just a tiny percentage of people start to actually accrue all of the wealth, and then everyone underneath starts to suffer, and they don't even realize they're suffering. And that's the annoying thing, that it's a slow attrition, and that people don't quite realize how denuded they've become of anything that is really meaningful, and how they're in a very Marxist kind of way, or Engels kind of way, they're really obsessed with buying the things that they themselves produce. I mean, it's kind of curious that we've got to a state where we're talking about the same sort of social inequities that we had in the late 19th century that led to 2 world wars. I think also it is. You got me thinking. I think I've answered your question. I'm going to go back to something that came to my mind when you were talking about the difference between religion and politics. And I was thinking of idleness, and I was thinking of something that I remember even my mother saying was the debt. You know, when I was just being idle, and I quite often was as a child. Well, I wasn't being idle. I was just looking at things. But I can remember being told that the devil finds work for idle hands. It's a tremendous story, isn't it? So, what is that devil in terms of religion? It could be interpreted in all sorts of things. In terms of politics or productivity, it's probably unproductive behaviour. And then you start to kind of qualify what production might be, productive labour. If you think of domestic labour, then you've got billions and billions of pounds worth of productive labour that is generally women working without being paid. So we know this kind of situation where a lot of the world's labour is actually unremunerated. But does that make it idle? Is that idle behaviour because it's not productive in the capitalistic sense? So yeah, and so I think yes, but idleness in terms of the devil. I think it's interesting that you can unplug your mind sometimes and become free thinking. And I mean, who knows where that would lead to? It might lead to dissent. Dissent, as history has shown us, isn't always a bad thing. It could be that idleness that leads, or not an idleness, but a re-evaluating of circumstances, or a rejection or a denial of the expected, might lead to a kind of emancipation.
I did do a bit of research, and I found that this exhibition it was based on the 7 deadly sins, and there was an exhibition purely just called Sloth, and they made this magazine about sloth and made it really kind of comedic and then satirical, but they wrote this interesting thing that Evagrius, who is a Greek 4th century theologian, the sin that he called acedia, the Greek for lack of care, did not simply indicate laziness or inactivity. These afflictions, which could prevent the monk from focusing on the God, were only half the problem. Acedia was also discernible in monks who exhibited a busy restlessness. So I guess in that sense of kind of religious aspect, I mean, from my kind of painting days and painting geometrically and searching for meaning in spirituality and everything, I kind of came to a conclusion that religions are primarily applied philosophies. So like a Buddhist philosophy of life and Hindu philosophy of life is different than Christian or Christian Judaic philosophy, you know, in resurrection or reincarnation, believing in hell or believing in nirvana, however you want to call it. They're all this similar, I guess, human-made principles to answer, you know, life or death questions.
I mean, I think it's Buddhism arguably is not a religion, but it's interpreted by people as a religion, and then and certainly not in the same way that that other world religions would be a set of instructions and a set of rules by which you should lead your life. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for nefarious reasons. But I think, yeah, it's interesting to kind of to take Buddhism and look at other world religions, because as I say, I think Buddhism, most people will accept, is only a religion if you want it to be, and then there's the flexibility of Buddhism. Otherwise, it's just it seems to be a set of very philanthropic, socially aware guidelines.
Yeah, to kind of complicate matter further, the word curating comes from the Latin curare, which is etymology for related to a notion of caring. So having what was the word, acedia, the lack of care, which is a sin, and then caring as a curator, puts me in a position where I can't be lazy, but I do it on daily basis. So it's an interesting kind of concept how the two words seem to have a similar origin, I guess. And then also that reminds me about how there's many books online about how to be more efficient, how to be organized, how to be productive, kind of self caring and helping. I mean, for example, I got this book, a bit of a plug, called Making Ideas Happen. Oh, there's the camera. Yeah. And so this is actually the second step that's actually helping us. So like I can come up with ideas easily. I kind of daydream as well, pretty much all day, every day. And but the thing is, those ideas pile up, but they don't get materialized. And so this book is kind of there to help me turn those ideas into an actual material project. But so yeah, that got me thinking how important is laziness actually for creative individuals. That's the mindset, like I mentioned before, like with the cleanest canvas, where many ideas come out of bloom when we think less. And so like, can we train to be lazy? Can we focus on being lazy and not distracted by our phones and apps, fulfilling that capitalistic utopia? But then also, in a way, this was something that the surrealists were focusing on. They studied dreams and their meanings, and then made the symbolisms such as clock, and then deserts, and then their whole construction of paintings and then sculptures was depicting these dreams. To a certain extent, I think I was talking with Christoph about this, that the surrealists kind of filtered those dreams into meaningful messages rather than keeping them raw and as pure and as wild as dreams can get, I guess. And so also, usually people go to cafes or parks to clear their minds. And so I wanted to ask you, do you have a place where you go to kind of clear your mind and where you kind of generate ideas most frequently? And does the space you work in affect your creative mindset?
Do you know, I was thinking about this, and I've already mentioned staring into the void. I'm quite happy to lie on the grass, and with my weird eyesight, being very good at seeing things in the micro, I can spend an hour looking at the roots of grass, and my mind has gone elsewhere. I've not been productive in the true sense of the word, but I've certainly allowed to clear my mind of all sorts of things, perhaps because I'm focusing on a world that is way beyond my scale. Staring into the distance as well, it's quite a Buddhist thing actually, to stare at the horizon, to see the sunset, and being able to you can focus on infinity wherever you are. It's often best not to do it when you're teaching or if you're in a meeting.
Yeah.
Or if you're driving. There are times when you should be more focused on the mundane physicalities of what you're doing. But I don't know. Lots of other people talk about, the bar in a bath or whatever. I find walking quite a good time as well. I think it's because you're always moving forward, and so actually you're partly you're concentrating more on motor skills and trying not to fall over, and trying not to be obstructed by things. But then that seems to release something of the just about under the subconscious, that enables unexpected things to bubble up, filter through. So yeah, daydreaming, kind of semi wakefulness. I often find that as I'm just waking up, as the first signs of morning are beginning to show, as the first kind of blackbird starts singing, and obviously something is stirring me physically, I'll get a momentary little rush of thinking, sometimes extraordinary clarity, enough to really wake me. And many times I've actually worked out problems, or I've come up with completely new ideas, things that just arrived in their totality, within those few seconds of semi-wakefulness. So I probably listed quite a few things there, and bus ride. I haven't been on a bus for months, but actually, public transport, being on a train, being on a bus, staring out of the window, absolutely brilliant. Again, I think it's that moving forward, so you're not having to worry too much about whether you should be productive, because just the moving forward is productive, and that enables enough space in your mind somewhere to let all those kind of spiky, errant things to just kind of come into focus.
And are you consciously making that decision, like, okay, now I will turn off my brain and let it go on a cruise mode, or like, how do you have control of it? Have you made sure, have you made it like more efficient, let's say, in a way?
Well, maybe not making it more efficient, but I've found things that make it that impede that process. And a good example is walking. I walk into work. It's about, 2 miles. And when I first started doing that, would have been 20 years ago now. I thought I'll listen to music, so I got some headphones and listened to music, and couldn't stand it. I was blocking out the environment that was partly responsible for clearing my mind, whereas listening to music was quite didactic in a way. I was walking, but I was separated from the experience of walking, and I was more obsessed with what I was listening to, what I would listen to next. Did I know the music? So
Or
I mean,
the lyrics, yeah.
Yeah, so there's an example of thinking, no, this isn't helpful. This is actually this time walking in to work, 45 minutes or so, is a wonderful time where nothing else can happen other than me propelling myself forwards and not falling over, but allowing my mind actually to wander across all sorts of subjects and into all sorts of territories. I don't think you can turn it on and off. That's just it. And it's that curious thing about creativity and inspiration. I know there's all that Turner thing about be at your studies by 9:30. That's inspiration. I've kind of rather misquoted, but in actual fact, I think, there are days when maybe you're trying to work on something creative and it just isn't working, and it's better to do something that is just prosaic, or practical. And likewise, there are times when you sit down to try to write something that needs to be written, but your mind is just so furtive and off in all sorts of directions that you're better off being creative and leaving the writing or something until tomorrow. But I think sometimes you can't control that, and that must be very frustrating for people that have to write scripts, or have to come up with ideas, or have got a show in a week's time and haven't made any work.
That's a good point as well. Having kind of the creativity when making physical art or writing a piece of text. I mean, they're both creative things, but to kind of require different levels of concentration of some sort.
Yeah, I think clearly there are very different types of writing as well. I mean, I would find myself across a week, I might write something to do. It might be a unit description for the course at university. Is very, very a very sort of mechanical type of writing, very instrumental sort of writing. I could be writing an application, which is a very different type of writing. And then I might find myself at the end of the week just writing for the sheer love of it, writing about clay pipes or writing about what type of blue the sky is. So I think, you know, writing itself can be so many different types of writing and use very different parts of your brain, your thinking. Whereas I think making art objects, I don't know, is there an equivalent? I suppose the differences I could think of would be working to commission. You've got a client that's commissioning you, and it's got to fit a particular wall in a building for a very particular purpose, and so it becomes a bit more instrumental in what you're doing. And then there's the speculative art making, where you wander into the studio or wherever, and you've got some materials, but you have no plan, you have no idea, so you just kind of start working, and it might be pointless, it might be wonderful, it might be that no one ever wants it, it's never shown or seen by anyone else, or it might be rubbish and you destroy it or recycle it. It's not, there isn't a distinction between writing and making artifacts. They can both be creative, they can both be practical, they can both be professional, they can be unprofessional, can be playful.
Also, there's a few things I wrote down that kind of got me thinking as well. Kind of when you mentioned productivity earlier, I was thinking about it. Maybe when someone says that they're not being productive, I'm thinking more of productive being a subjective thing, depending on what your priorities are. If your priorities are to be grading people, you know, giving people marks, and if you're not doing that, then yes, you're unproductive, because that's the set goal. But if you don't have a goal, and then end up planting vegetables, which I also started doing as well, but it's first time and doing it in an apartment with this gloomy weather outside. Everything is going to be nice and lush. But yeah, so yeah, I was thinking that productiveness is quite subjective. But then also I was thinking, I think as one of the reasons why I started doing MA also was because I kind of didn't feel I had enough skills to kind of move into the real world, and kind of being international student, having limited visa access, I kind of needed more time, and so therefore I'm doing masters here as well. But I was thinking if the creatives need that kind of time to. There's an interesting piece that Stilinovic made called "Artist at Work," which it's a photo of him just laying down in bed with open eyes, and
Yes.
I think that that's very accurate, depiction of it. But then also in this system where you spend the time to earn money, and then to spend your spend time, pretty much that's the definition of money, to survive and to have basic rights. How is there a way, do you think artists should be more vocal about having some system to support them for being lazy? Since laziness is what Stilinovic was claiming that makes artists.
I think it's a really important question, and I think here there are distinctions between different types of the arts, and I think it might be more possible for a writer or or an actor to be paid for not necessarily lazy. If we translate laziness into that period of not knowing and of trying to find something new, if a writer is trying to find the right voice for what they're trying to say, they're coming up with a new idea. If it's a
The
novel
development of it, yeah.
And likewise, if somebody's writing a play, or if they've got a play that they're acting, or they've got a script for a film, and they've got to spend some time trying to work out what is this? How do I do this? Well, in many ways, that could be unproductive time. I've no doubt that executive producers in film and television will be saying, "Come on, this has been 4 weeks now and I haven't seen anything. What are you doing?" But of course, it's all part of it. That rehearsal is part of the final production that is a big hit that everyone loves because they've never seen it before, and it's quite brilliant. Now, does the visual artist have that same recognition for performance, for rehearsal time? Something I've used this phrase with students as well, that your periods of inactivity are not inactive. You've been thinking. This is rehearsal time. You haven't made a drawing or a screen print or a sculpture or a performance piece because you've been rehearsing it in your mind. But I'm not sure that unless you're on a retainer with a gallery, which is a rarity, isn't it? Really, that an artist gets remuneration for those periods of laziness or flexibility and creative thinking, and the point at which they're not having to produce something because they're thinking about a really good model for where that does happen is Wising Arts Centre. As you know, we've worked with Wising Arts Centre quite a bit, and we did a wonderful workshop with Taylor Lamel, who's an artist and writer, this year. And what Taylor Lamel was saying, that the residency that she had at Wising Arts Centre enabled her to not feel as if she needed to come up with anything. She knew she would, of course, but Donna Linus at Wising Arts Centre always knows that people that are in residency will come up with something, but there's no expectation, which clears the air entirely. And that's a bit of a rarity. When else would an artist be told you can spend several weeks just clearing your mind, just existing, maybe being lazy in some kind of curious creative way, and being paid for it? I suppose there's a problem if after 3 months there's absolutely nothing to show for it. I always think it's funny that it's not funny really, but when the Happy Mondays got an enormous payment to record their album in, I can't remember which Caribbean island it was it Montserrat, I think, or somewhere. And they got there and they spent they sold all the recording equipment and all the instruments and just had a good time. And they didn't produce an album, which is funny, but actually that's true laziness. That's sloth.
Yeah. Definitely. And then kind of we brushed on the topic of education, and since this whole symposium and then the idea of this exhibition of mine was to kind of start initiating the dialogue between the East and the West, and me kind of being born after the East has fallen, let's say, and having majority of my education through the British international system. I gotta admit, like, I don't know much about how's the education in Serbia, for example, or the rest of the Eastern European countries. I know, for example, art academies, not the private ones, tend to be quite academic and traditional, where there's still live drawings and still kind of the old school way of teaching art.
Yes, I mean, we both have experience of the academy in Riga. It was that a year ago, or not quite, but And it's interesting that there's only the indication that it's only in the last few years that that contemporary fine art practice seems to have been engaged with fully at the Art Academy in Riga. And I know that the very last East International held at well, it was Norwich School of Art Design then. The guest curators came from Rasta Gallery in Warsaw, and they had been educated in an academy system in former Eastern communist Poland that was based on an early 20th century form of the academy. But they were the first cohort of students to point out, as glasnost was beginning to soften up the kind of the exchange of information, they were the first to challenge their professors and to say, look, there's a whole art world that is internationally recognized that is not being taught in the academies in Eastern Europe. And that's largely the reason why they were invited to be curators of East International, because they bridged that gap between a communist East and a post-communist East, post-1989 Eastern Europe, and contemporary practice, and all that new art might be representing in terms of a change in Eastern Europe. I go back to what you said about education, because I think this is an important thing, and as in my job, I think I see this very much as an exchange and as a use value. If I've spent my life trying to understand what it is to be creative and to be an artist, and I also understand about systems within higher education in the United Kingdom, I think it's my job to make sense of that, to guide students through their learning, to make them aware of what is contemporary and what is flexible and creative in terms of art, but also to deliver that according to a system that is recognized and that is fair as well. So I think it's, so it's at that point that I can't allow myself to be lazy. That's my job, and I've got to do it well. And it very much, if you think of it in terms of productivity, it is use value. I'm using my creativity as something that I think that is a specialism, and that can be converted and given back to other people through the way that I might be able to organize a team to give students an experience. It's a tricky thing, but I think it's interesting, and I love working in education for that very reason. I think whenever there are all sorts of situations where somebody can learn from somebody else, and it doesn't have to be an educational establishment. It happens in open studios or just exhibitions when people have a chat over a beer. There are lots of occasions when somebody learns from somebody else. But I think it's a privilege working as a tutor and in an educational capacity, and especially in the arts.
Yeah, definitely something kind of sharing that passion and kind of bridging that kind of institutional requirements with the young creative brains. And that's something I wanted to kind of point out, because I feel like primary universities are secondary or tertiary secondary education.
Universities.
Yeah.
Well, this will be on tertiary. Yeah, it's the higher education sector.
Right. Yeah. So primary and secondary education, like primary schools and stuff like that, I think they're quite limiting, and then they are funneling children's creativity to a certain extent, whilst still teaching them the basic set of skills. Now we're going to learn how to lino print, now we're going to learn how to shade and mix colors. But then I think that's something that it took me some time, and luckily I did the year zero at the uni to kind of open up to that possibility of having that freedom. And of course, that freedom is a double-edged sword of either you are going to stick to working or not do any work and get marked down. And that's actually something that I find also fascinating on the unit briefs that we get both in BA and MA. Those briefs include those estimated hours a unit should take, and
Mm.
it's I believe those are beneficial guidelines for students to kind of think how to organize their time per week and stuff like that. But then also it sets expectations and some pressure for students. Are those hours something you consider when looking at students' work, and do you see correlation between the number of hours put into work and the so-called quality of the work?
It's a really good one. And then look, this comes down to qualitative, the difference between qualitative and quantitative. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um, so let's look at this from a number of perspectives. I mean, a student could produce a lot of work. They could spend a lot of hours. They could go over the prescribed hours for a unit and produce a lot of work that goes nowhere. And this is the reality. This is the harsh reality. Somebody could work harder in terms of labor and produce more in terms of outcomes, material outcomes. But it might not have the quality of something that somebody else has produced in a much smaller quantity and maybe have spent less time. It comes back to what I said about rehearsal time. It comes back to it was the thing that I would always say: if you're not in, prove that you've been using that time in some way. Now, actually, I think if somebody is just asleep in bed all day long, I don't think anyone could argue that that's been productive time. But if they've got up late, but they've had a flashbulb idea and they've rehearsed that in their mind, and they're somehow able to produce an outcome that shows that there's been that maturation of ideas, then we're in that slightly tricky position where you have to acknowledge that there is built into that, implied in that outcome, all of that rehearsal time. This is all that we've been talking about. Is that whatever um, uh, um, massages a creative thinking in somebody, whether it's staring at the grass or into space or just going around all day long on a bus, or staying up late and sleeping in the morning. If the outcome has implied in it all of that rehearsal time, and actually is also a powerful piece of artwork, then the job has been done. It's a contentious thing, but I think probably it's frustrating in education to see that. Outside of educational systems, it's absolutely fine. But within an educational system where you're always trying to make sure that things are fair, and you're balancing the qualitative and the quantitative, you'll always get anomalies where somebody will have used their time creatively, but not necessarily productively throughout, but come up with something at the end that is explicit in its intelligence and creativity and ingenuity.
Yeah, definitely. And this kind of leads me to like the last point of the symposium, kind of to wrap it up, would be the, like we mentioned briefly, the mental health of students and the creative individuals in general. Because a lot of colleagues of mine, they've been saying they don't have inspiration to work nor the motivation. And I, like, personally, whenever it's a gloomy weather like today, I just don't have the energy. The winter period for me is the worst because the deadlines are coming, but there's no work being released. And then even those thoughts are not then properly then demonstrated to at least achieve those learning outcomes. So it's kind of wasteful period, but it's something that has to be kind of, being aware of it is, I guess, the first step, and then doing something about it is the next. So I think I guess the conclusion, and then I would like to leave the open mic to you as well, to kind of summarize, that laziness, I mean, I would say laziness isn't that bad, and maybe it's even crucial to be aware of it, and not have some too large of expectations to always be producing things. Yeah, and to kind of have that balance of caring and not caring, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's, goodness me, there's so much in this. I mean, I think for a start, artists, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, throughout history, have always, in some curious way, benefited from melancholia, um, probably from seasonal adjusted disorder. It's very difficult in the winter months to see that there's any benefit to feeling that way. But in the spring, when there's a reversal of that feeling, almost like the exaggeration of the warmth of sun after the rain, the creativity flows in such an extraordinary way. I don't think this is a helpful way to be, but most creative people feel that they are on a cycle of ups and downs, and the ups are tremendously creative, and vigorous and vivid, and the downs can lead to catastrophe. But that's not a new thing. I think that's always, and particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. And oddly enough, it seems that south of the Tropic of Capricorn, it's not as bad as it is north of the Tropic of Cancer. This is a metaphysical thing. It's not just a psychological manifestations of something that is at a chemical level in our physical state. So there's a whole thing there. I think in terms of how you might feel about laziness, compared to, let's think of the right word, inertia. I think there are times, I've certainly felt it myself, maybe when I was younger, but even now, although I've strategized to get through it, that there are times when it's not the type of laziness that we've been talking about, the sort of the freedom of the mind, the sense of no obligation to be productive. It's something far less productive than that. It's an inertia. It's a sense of something that is completely unplugged and withdrawn. And I think that the absolute epitome of anxiety that builds up to a depression, to a state where nothing makes sense, is entirely unhelpful. So I think yeah, there are distinctions. There's this kind of delicate thing of melancholia and how that can lead to creativity, but there are those lows that are not about laziness. I think laziness, there's always a latent intent to be productive within those lazy moments, those rehearsal moments that we've talked about. But the worst of of depression and debilitating mental health issues is a complete lack of mobility and mental psychological mobility. And it's difficult to know whether we're seeing a higher instance of mental health issues now, or whether this is just something that wasn't recognized in the past. I can remember my own father saying that in the 1940s and 50s, when he had some difficult patches, that the last thing you would do is to tell anyone. He just got through it. Everyone got through it. So I suspect that because we haven't changed physically that much for thousands of years, we've always been stressed, we've always got anxious, we've always got depressed. Certainly those living in the north have always experienced melatonin and serotonin levels dropping in the winter. But other people would have a more sensitive, a more exaggerated propensity to feel depression. I suspect that's been with us as a species for thousands of years, and it's highlighted in different ways. And no doubt social media is not the cause. It can't, social media and the mechanics of things like mobile phones can't be causing heightened levels of anxiety and depression. But they're certainly enabling us to exchange that with each other. And so I think we're more aware than we've ever been of I'm trying to remember who it was that said, if only we could all accept that we're all imperfect, we would feel a lot happier. I can't think who that was. But there's
pretty good quote, yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, to be honest, show me somebody that's I don't want to meet somebody that's perfect. We're all imperfect, but we all, and this comes out of advanced capitalism, out of neoliberalism and deregulation. We have to measure all the time to make sure that we know exactly whether something is better or not, whether we're getting better value for money or not. And because we measure, our expectations are beyond 80%, 90%, 100%. Everything's got to be an absolute green smiley face. An amber meh is not good enough. And that certainly has made us feel very inadequate and very aware of our fragility. And we shouldn't, you know, to fuck up occasionally, where, you know.
I think we kind of said to the best.
We talked a lot there. I think that's how creatives use laziness. And I think something that we've really not talked about much at all, but I think is tied in very much with Stilinovic and that era of European politics is the politics of laziness. And it's a statement, it's a political statement. It's actually quite deliberate withdrawal of your labor to make a point. I just think that's a very different thing about laziness, the whole hippie kind of thing of the 60s and the notion of sitting in rather than being active. You're being active, but by not doing anything.
Yeah, some sort of strike, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, a kind of strike. Yeah, an inactivity, a withdrawal of labour from those that are benefiting from it. But that would be another symposium altogether, perhaps.
There you go. Yeah, sounds great. Cool. Thank you very much, and thank you guys for watching.